Hi, everyone. I'm not going to go through everyone's bios because you have them there. We're talking about streets today, and I'm going to let Anna kick it off to talk about the National Street Service.
Sure, happy to. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for sticking around and being here to talk about one of the most important features of the future of mobility. I know a lot of people are here are interested in talking about disruption in technology, in vehicles, and we're here to talk about streets, which is actually potentially the most important feature of this new sort of mobility environment. It's the infrastructure that all of this new mobility and thinking about the future of how we get around cities, where that work will actually take place. So we've put up a couple of slides just to breeze through some of what we've done with the National Street Service. So the National Street Service was a project with Gale and Greenfield Labs. I'll let Ryan describe Greenfield Labs, but in brief, it was a project to think not about technological innovation in vehicles or even design innovation as it pertains to streets. It's about the thing that we actually really haven't figured out, which is the cultural technology of the future of our streets. It's actually about people's ability to think differently about what streets can be in the future. And it's not something that we got right at the advent of the last mobility revolution. And we really hope that as people are thinking in new ways about what this public right-of-way can be, they're thinking about what's the culture of how we change our streets. So at Gale, we think about making cities for people, and we use a broad array of tools to do that. A lot of it is about understanding what people really want and the intersection between design and people's quality of life. So when Greenfield Labs came to us and asked us to think differently about how we design the streets of the future, we actually thought about framing a new type of organization called the National Street Service. It's meant to be sort of funny. You could laugh a little bit. It's meant to be like the National Park Service, an entity which is set up to steward and support and treasure this national resource, this commons. Streets actually make up 80% of all of our public space in cities and up to 20% of all of the land area in cities. And yet, why do we not think of them as this wonderful commons to steward and treasure like we do our oceans, like we do our atmosphere? So to sort of learn how we sort of shape the hearts and minds around streets, sometimes we talk about it as a YIMBY for streets, getting people to realize that streets can actually be an important part of their life and have people participate in making their streets something that they want to be. We created a set of curricula. We call it the Soul Searching Curriculum. It's available for you too. We have an app called Streets. And we developed this curriculum to help people understand the role of streets in their life and then create small little experiments for how streets can serve them better. We tested this in a variety of different contexts that we thought if we made a program that worked in Boise, Idaho, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and a couple of other cities, that if we worked with these different folks to make something that worked in all of those contexts, we'd make something that could scale nationally. So we did that over the last 8 months. This project is in part about changing the culture of what streets can be for, but it's also about changing the culture of the nation's largest car company. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ryan to talk about a little bit about why Ford Motor Company is interested in sponsoring a national street service and what they're doing with some of the things that we learned.
Great, thanks Anna. Good rundown. And so if you're confused, essentially this is a program whereby we go into a community and run an initiative to engage with people about their streets, right? And so there's all these tools. There's a website and an app, and those would be the two places I would point you to find more about this, and we're happy to provide more of that afterwards. But why are we doing this, right? And so Anna kind of hinted at it a little bit. The streets are a place for all of us as people to populate. This is where our lives are connected. If you get up and go around, if you take transportation, that happens in a street. And whether you're walking, whether you're biking, whether you're taking any mode that exists, your context that mobility happens in is within our streets. And Ford as a company has realized that the context within which we're providing that mobility that we offer matters. And so we have an aim to, you heard Toyota say the same thing this morning, but Ford has an aim to be not just a car company, but a mobility company. And I think that that recognition is something that's really valuable. And it recognizes that at the heart of the transportation that we are providing is not the cars that we're selling, is not even the streets that it's operating within, it's the people who are using it. And so transportation is not an end in and of itself. Transportation is a means to an end, a means for us to be able to live our lives. And we as a company, so I work at Greenfield Labs, which is an incubation lab in Palo Alto, California, that is part of Ford. And our job is to, what I tell my friends, think about the future of transportation for Ford, and think about where might be the right places for us to find opportunities for this company, but where might be the right places for us also to learn about the best ways to provide mobility. And so as part of our lab, what we do is we stand up pilots, we build prototypes, we partner with a company called IDEO, and then as well great consultants like Gail to provide some of these interventions. And so we have different pilots or prototypes or concepts that we've developed around the country and around the world. And this was an example of that. And what we do with that is we bring something that I think is of value to the cities, to the communities, and to the people that we're providing this deep participatory engagement initiative opportunity to. Is allowing the people that we worked with to think about their streets in a different way. It's in some ways empowering them to realize that they have agency to change the places that they've perhaps taken for granted before. But it's also a way for us to learn more about that context, that mobility context that everything is happening in. And we learn that from those people. We of course, go out and observe and immerse ourselves in that sort of setting and that experience, but getting at some of those underlying emotional drivers for why people feel the way that they do about a space that they're in is really important. And how then you might design a better system, both the contextual system and the units within that. And that's of great value. As we think about the future and future opportunities, this can be a piece of that puzzle.
Great. I'm going to just back up a little bit on that and share my anecdote that you both know. So my mother-in-law lives in a gated community in Orange County in a cul-de-sac. And one night at dinner, my daughter was about 6. She was lamenting the fact that this new family had moved in and their young children were playing in the cul-de-sac. And this was not something that they should be doing, to your point. And she said, I don't know why the children are playing there. Everyone knows that streets are for cars. And my 6-year-old said, no, Granny, streets are for people, not cars. And I, said a little prayer to myself. I could, of course, never say this to my mother-in-law, but I've trained my child well. And this idea that streets are for people, not cars, is actually a quite revolutionary and radical thing to say out loud to a lot of people who can't even, that's just like so far out of their frame of reference. But if you think back to say, I'm thinking of streets in New York where the school doesn't have a playground, so they close the street off for part of the day so the kids can play in the street. Or
I say we open the street up.
Exactly.
To the people, yeah.
But so this is like a change in thinking. So what you guys are doing with the street service is really focusing on that. On the counter narrative, though, at the worst case scenario, is say the Koch brothers initiative that I'm sure many in this room are aware of to actively defund or not fund new public transit projects. So in fact, getting people to go the opposite way. When you look at the street service, what are your hopes and aspirations for making this a movement in the way that I think the anti-transit, anti-street people have actually done a really great job at, and maybe you can speak a little bit to that.
You know, one of the most interesting things that we found is we thought that one of the most exciting things we would do is giving people all these tools to make little experiments in their street. But the thing that people actually loved across our volunteer cohort was just being asked the question, what do streets mean to you? What are they good for you? And you know what people say? It's not that they want to park their car right in front of their home, although they like doing that, that's for sure. They want to meet their neighbors. They want a safe place for their kids to play. They want to feel the sun. They want to connect to their sense of place alone, but in the context of others. In short, they want a great public space. Streets are public spaces. And so what we actually, my greatest aspirations for the National Street Service as a movement is that it is like the YIMBY for streets. It brings more people into a conversation that provides the political firepower for all of the guerrilla bureaucrats out there who are doing really interesting work. and that it continues to support Ford to try to be a leader in what it means to be a mobility company and not just a car manufacturing company. There's a ton that you guys and the organization that you work for has to learn, and it comes from people on the street and their lived experience and the things that they deeply want, which is freedom. You know, like the Model T was sold to people with the promise of freedom. Right now, the Model T in your private vehicle doesn't deliver that. You know, the streets don't deliver that. We have to have something else. Our streets need to change. We all need to sort of be thinking differently about what the street really means to us to get there.
Yeah, I do feel that there's this, I always joke about the kind of gateway drug effect, that people need to experience what the thing is in order to change the behavior. And I was talking to someone the other day who lived in San Francisco and had been commuting to the South Bay but got a new job, and so was now just taking the bus like 2 stops to work, and he's just like, oh my God, my commute, I never use my car anymore, and it hadn't even occurred to him that this was a possibility until it was a possibility, so I love that this kind of opens that up for people. I would be an irresponsible journalist if I didn't ask, though, why a car company is trying to get people to be interested in things other than cars.
Well, I think it's, I tried to hint at this a little bit previously, and I think that it's a recognition, number one, that the space of transportation is changing. I mean, we must all openly acknowledge, right? So technology is intervening in ways that it just hasn't previously, and changing the way that the space functions, the industry functions. But second, I think that there's also an overt recognition that perhaps things aren't entirely as they should be, right? And so we see in the country way too many fatalities that result from traffic instances. And I think the number was 37,500 in 2016. So it's like this slow drip effect that we almost don't even notice anymore. But somewhere in Sacramento today, it's likely that somebody was in a really horrific incident, and we just don't think about it. And so is there an opportunity to do something better? And then I think that there's other pressures. So for instance, the pressures of climate change. Here in California, we have very aggressive goals for meeting our climate goals. And if we're going to do that, we have to change the way that we move around. And there are a lot of pieces of that puzzle, but we want to be part of that conversation. And so those things have led us to continuing to explore what it means to provide people transportation, to provide people that fundamental opportunity to live their lives, right? And so that has changed in terms of form of technology through the decades and through the centuries. But I think that there's opportunity to build that. So to that end, and kind of to your prior question, our aspirations for this program, number one, we want it to live on. And so there's a couple things that I can kind of announce today and share. The first thing is that the program is aimed to continue. So we've gone to 5 cities so far, and the aim is in 2019 to continue to grow it and to go to 6 more cities. And so if you're a city who's interested in these sorts of things, absolutely reach out to me. We are looking at some places, but I think that there's definitely opportunities in front. We heard from a lot of people that they wanted exposure to this sort of thing. And so an aspiration is that there is broader exposure. To your point of people being able to experience it, I think that as we open people's hearts, minds, souls, spirits about the opportunity of the mobility space, that has value. The second thing that is an aspiration is that we influence the conversation about how our mobility system happens. And one of the ways that we do that is by trying to get better, and it's incrementally, right? I think that we've learned a lot. Human history has provided us great lessons in how to build cities. But incrementally, I think we continue to do better at shaping streets. And there's, again, pressures. Before the session, we were talking about micromobility, and there's pressures on, how does the street shape itself for the scooters and the dockless bikes that are becoming more ubiquitous in many of our cities. And it has to be a malleable space. And so how do you design a street most effectively? And so drawing from lessons from the National Street Service, we today released, and you can go to ourlivingstreets.com and find design principles for the living street of tomorrow. And these are based on insights that we gleaned from this particular program. And the design principles are intended to just share little tidbits of that knowledge, that ability to hopefully design our streets in a little bit better way. And that's good for the people who are experiencing the street, most importantly, but it's also good for somebody like Ford to provide effective, efficacious mobility.
Anna, when you started doing outreach in these different cities, who was the most resistant? A couple questions, like what were people resistant to?
Yeah.
What was the biggest or best sort of transformational?
Oh my gosh. The best transformation was in Boise. We were so scared to go to Boise because we're like, oh my gosh, there are no streets in Boise, there's only highways. And it's actually true, the highway district, the Ada County Highway District, runs all of the streets in the city. So you can imagine what the neighborhood streets look and feel like. They feel like they're built for fast-moving vehicles. And we had an open house. We invited all of our potential street rangers. We called them street rangers in Boise. And one of the most amazing transformations was a woman who came up to me and she said, I'm a lifelong traffic engineer, and I just don't think I'm creative enough for this. I just don't think this is for me. And it turned out, and we got her along, like, you don't have to be creative. We got all the tools for you. Just like do this audio exercise. It's just wonderful. All you have to do is listen. Just like put in your earbuds and walk down the street and think about what the space is to you. And by the end of her journey with the National Street Service, she was like organizing her whole street into a block party for safe streets, and she was like the most creative, engaging person.
Another transformation that I would point to is in Philadelphia, we had the opportunity to work with several youth. I was inspired seeing the video from the prior session. For those of you who saw it, the ability that we have to intervene at perhaps a younger age than we think of with a lot of our community engagement aspects is really important. And so in Philadelphia, we formed a team of youth who were kind of from junior high age up to high school age, and worked with them. And you've seen some of the pictures, good timing right here, on the screen. These children still opened their eyes up to the world that was around them in a brand new way. It was absolutely fascinating to see some of the introflexion that happened. And one of the women, she had been in a car crash or been the victim of a car crash when she was much younger. And the ability for her to kind of reflect on what that had meant for her life, and then to think about the possibility of perhaps changing that so other children wouldn't have to experience some of that, was really, really powerful. And so I think that was another good example of kind of a transformed mind in the chance that we had to interact.
Ryan, you and I were talking earlier about this notion that, right now we have the car and everything else is alternative transportation. And, Ford's not only investing in this, it's got bikes and scooters and microtransit and all these sorts of things. So is part of the strategy to kind of get to a place where the car becomes one of the alternatives or the alternative and everything else? And what do you guys think is the best strategy to get to this notion of, I hate to use the term multimodal in public, it's the worst term, it means nothing to anybody, that you're taking many forms of transportation and that your way of getting from where you need to go every day is, oh, maybe I'll walk to work and then I'll take the bus home and then I need to pick my kid up in the car, and it's all of these options. And is that a huge thrust of what you're doing, and what are the ways that are most effective to get people to think beyond their normal way of getting around?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge challenge. And so I'll plug again the design principles. You should all hit the website so we can see that result right away. But I think the third principle for good mobility, we said, is that people should have real choices. And by real, we mean, some of the things that came up on the TDM panel this morning. I'll use that describer. That the pricing is right, that there's availability, that there's access both physically and socially, right? And so they have a real choice in how they get around. And sure, perhaps we want to hand in various modes of that choice, but I think with the end aim to provide, again, that accessibility that is so important to life. And I think that's a real opportunity, and that's something that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I'll say also, initially this project, before we even conceived of the National Street Service, we wanted to come up with a street which was radically multimodal. That was the phrasing we used, radically multimodal streets. And then what we ended up coming up with was a project that was about streets as places first, as places for people first. And one of the other principles from the Our Living Streets website, which you should all check out, it's great, is that streets should be forgiving, meaning that you shouldn't pay for a mistake in the street with your life, which is so often how most of our streets function right now. What that means is rebalancing how those with the most power on the street, those driving private vehicles, armored and protected, actually have to be the most careful, and people who are the least protected should be the most protected by the streets. So.
I think that what the smartest design is design that starts with the human at the center of what you're designing for. And so in a lot of ways, I would say the smartest thing is simple. The smart is simple. And a lot of times when we're talking about smart cities, 80% of what we're talking about is technology, and maybe 20% is the people. But that should absolutely be flipped on its head. 80, 90, 95% of what we should be talking about is the aims that you're trying to reach for people. And maybe technology has a small role to facilitating that. I had a great conversation with a transportation leader from Portland in the last month, and she talked about the really actionable human quality of life goals that they have in place. And they don't have goals to bring a particular technology. They don't have goals to achieve a certain level of traffic on their streets, but they do have goals for certain quality of life factors, for certain human outcome indicators, for certain levels of equity that I think are really important. And I think that if we have those sorts of targeted goals, and if we built and designed our transportation system accordingly, we might result in a system that looks a little bit different than today, but I think it's still room for people to have cars. I think there's still room for people to have all different modes. But I think it's a reframing of how we think about what is the smartest pursuit that we might have.
I love that you brought the simple and kind of non-tech approach. I wrote this piece earlier this year called "Autonomous Vehicles Won't Save Cities," and I think that what has troubled me about the autonomous vehicle debate is it's all about the technology, right? These are going to be safer, faster, they're going to change cities in a million ways, but ultimately, as is the current situation, we're just going to have the same amount of cars in the same space, going at the same speed, except you'll be sitting in the back seat. Right. And that's not where we need to go. So what I love about this project, and as I'm looking at these slides, there's so much, one, it's not about sensors, it's not about technology, it's not about equipping things with RFID tags, or I read today that people who jaywalk in Los Angeles are now going to have to wear reflective vests, which is like, are they going to have scarlet letter J's on them also? Putting the onus of safety on the pedestrian as opposed to the car. And Spur published a piece a few months back called 11 Ways to Make Streets Safer with or Without AVs. And I love that you've sort of approached this as it is not tech dependent. And I wonder if you could talk, Anna, a little bit about that. And also, there's so much great signage in this project.
I actually want to talk about that for a second.
I'd love for you to talk about the signage.
So we're looking at images right now from the Jaywalkers Bill of Rights. We actually have a little microsite called the Jaywalkers Bill of Rights, .org.com. So one of the things that was really important to us as we were experimenting with these projects was making something that felt natural. Because in fact, everybody knows that our streets should be different, right? Like, we all know when we're sitting in traffic, it's like, it's no La La Land. We're not out there like dancing on our cars. Like, we are pissed off, we're frustrated, we're mad at ourselves. Like, what is it that long and arduous commutes is actually one of the major things that leads people to leave their jobs? Like, we all know deep down that something's wrong. We don't need scientists to tell us that. We each know that in ourselves. And so we really wanted the projects that we were developing in our sort of local lab. Some of the projects that you're seeing here, we've developed in our own National Street Service laboratories, and then some of them were done with all of these 100 volunteers. And what was winning, about the winning ideas that we ended up producing around signage were things that felt natural. So for the Jaywalkers Bill of Rights, we developed a series of signs that are meant to fit in actually the backing of like a convenience store advertisement. So every advertisement like frame in like any sort of bodega corner store has like a thing that says thank you for shopping here. So we sort of hacked that and said thank you for walking here. Oh, and by the way, here's the Jaywalkers Bill of Rights. Like you should be able to walk where you need to walk, and you shouldn't have to cross the street if you feel unsafe you shouldn't have to need to cross the street. We did this in the Tenderloin where there are issues around jaywalking and talking about sort of racialized policing in that particular context. And it really sort of, those signage pieces, they're meant to sort of feel like they belong, but that also just be a little bit weird enough to catch your eye and cause you to reflect on your own assumptions, which is really the point. Like the output that we're interested in here is mindset change. It's not about actually anything more complicated than that.
No, it's like that great street project that says you can get to this in 2 minutes, you can get to this in 3 minutes, and it's so simple that I think we all have a tendency to overlook. I mean, it's like when I lived in London once and I realized I had been taking the underground to go like across the street, like change, because I had never bothered to try and do it. And again, it's that gateway thing, like how can you get people to be there. Brian, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah,
for us
no, I
about
think
this
that,
project?
so I'm a transportation engineer and an urban planner, and I think that thus I'm kind of inherently passionate about these things, right? I mean, this is my career and something that I care greatly about. But what was really cool about this project, and I guess if there's one thing that I would want people to take away from this, is that these spaces are really, really important. The way that a street feels, the character of that street is really the character of your city. And so if the place that you're in feels a certain way, in large part, that's driven by the streets that are around it. And guess what? We all collectively as taxpayers own that space. There's more land in streets than basically any other usage around the country, right? And so we have huge agency, all of us, to shape the way that our cities look and feel. And we can shape that in many different directions. And we don't all have to agree, but I think that we have the chance to do that. And that's something that I'm really excited about. And it's something that we found this program was actually quite effective in offering. So take it from us that you can go and advocate for change on your local street. You can make your street a beautiful place if it isn't already. And I'm excited to hear some of the things that you guys might do. Please come up to me afterwards and share how you've advocated for your streets.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
All right.
Thank you. Oh,
I just
closing?
have just one more closing remark, which is that this whole conference and a lot of conversations have been so interesting around technology and design around like curb radii and really focus things. Some of the driving questions that we came into this project with that we still have are really around like empathy. How do you nudge people into participation? How do you understand shared values across different people? And these are questions that still drive us, so we're also interested in new collaborators and people who are interested in the sort of cultural dimension of our changing streets and our changing mobility patterns.
Thank you both. Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Thanks, all.
Thank you.